All right, so good evening, everybody. My name is Liz Torres-Melendez, and I am the Assistant Site Manager at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum. And I'm really excited to be presenting this next installation of our Black Women in History lecture series. Tonight, I'm so happy that we are joined by Dr. Faye Spencer Maor. She is a native of the Deep South, being born in Alabama and raised in Georgia. She attended a segregated elementary school and a desegregated junior high school and high school. Those experiences gave her a unique perspective on the dynamic of diverse classroom spaces. Spencer Maor received a BS degree in journalism from Florida A&M University, an MA from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and a PhD in writing studies from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Since beginning her academic career, Spencer Maor has served as a journalism and English faculty at institutions. My tongue is just not wanting to function properly tonight. At institutions such as Delaware State University, Savannah State University, and Valdosta State University, and as communications director of 1890 programs at Lincoln University of Missouri. Currently, she's a tenured professor of English at North Carolina A&T State University. Her research incorporates her interest in teaching in journalism, American and African American literature. She says her research has a connectedness to pedagogical practices that value positive encouragement of students' home language, while at the same time teaching them standard ways and techniques of using the language. More specifically, her research examines and reclaims literacy practices that directly impact writing, literacy, and literary pedagogies today. Today, we'll be getting a presentation about the history and work of 19th century pioneers in the education of African Americans. Today's presentation will center the work of Frances Jackson Coppin and a few of her contemporaries. So I'm really excited to turn this over to Dr. Maor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate that. And it is such a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you tonight about something and some people that I'm very passionate about. And so I guess without further ado, what I'm going to do is share my screen with you so we can begin to talk about the people that I think we all should know about, and that are connected to our hosts tonight as well. I would like to say, if you have any questions or any comments, if you would, while I'm speaking or presenting, please put them in the chat. And I'm hoping that I will have enough time, and I think we plan to have enough time for question and answer afterwards. So I entitled this presentation, Rediscovering and Reclaiming Her Stories, Frances Coppin and Her Friends During the Work of Education. Now, for me, the 19th century, we will find Black women, and specifically African-American teachers, were leaders in the communities they served and leaders in terms of what the progress of African Americans should be. Primarily, their work centered around eradicating the idea of the inferiority of African Americans' intellect, and also to show they were concerned about also showing the vital need to have women, especially Black women, involved in all of the efforts that centered around progress of the race and of uplifting the race. So I'm going to talk about three particular women tonight because if you study the 19th century and you really focus on African American women, there were so many women doing all kinds of work and who were doing outstanding work in a number of areas. And it is an area of study and research that I think you can spend a lifetime looking at. And so I've decided to focus in on three in particular tonight. And I just want to tell you about their lives, their accomplishments, and how they were received during their time. Of course, because the title of this talk is Frances Coppin, I want to talk about Frances Coppin first. And the reason I want to talk about her is because she is one of the women who began her public activities and her educational activities in the mid-19th century. She is, by, I guess, chronologically, the oldest woman that I'm going to talk about tonight. She was busy, she was a radical, and she was quiet and demure at the same time. She was tireless, and her life and her work were consumed by her notion of the intellectual equality of African Americans and African American women specifically. She is, among this group, one of the only African American women of the 19th century whose fame and notoriety is connected to her teaching solely. She had a mantra when she has a text called Reminiscences of Life and Hints on Teaching. And in that particular book, she talks a little bit about her life. And she says that when she was a little girl and she was first exposed to learning, she wanted to, quote, get an education and teach her people. And that is, in fact, what she did. So before I go any further, I just want to thank Liz Menendez and the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum for hosting me. Thank you. We've been working on this for a year and it wouldn't be possible without her. So I don't want to go any further without making sure that I thank you formally and publicly, Liz, for giving me this opportunity. So I'm starting with this quote to talk about Coppin because in a book that was published in 1993 entitled Negro Women, Their Achievements and Activities, a physician from Texas named M.A. Majors compiled a book that has about maybe 300 Black women from the 19th century. And he gives us brief descriptions of their accomplishments and their activities. And just the fact that that book has over 300 names of women, and Black women particularly, you will see that this was a time of a lot of activity and public work by African Americans. And so he took it upon himself in 1993, actually, the book, he compiled it over about 10 years. And he presents it as an example of what, as you see from this quote, he says that our intelligent women glorify the race. And he says that they're doing this work in an environment that's full of tears and doubts. And so he wants us, and he wanted his contemporaries at that time to see that these women were doing amazing things in a very difficult environment. So let's go on to look at Frances Jackson Coppin. The circumstances of her life affected in a direct way her attitude and her ultimate teaching methods in the classroom. She was born into slavery in 1837 in Washington, D.C. And she had relatives, in her own words, who were able to purchase their freedom before her. And there is some controversy about one particular uncle who purchased her aunts, but did not purchase her. There is some question in the history as to his reticence for purchasing her freedom, and that it might be because the slave master was her father. but we don't have any concrete evidence that that was the case. However, she did have an aunt whose name was Sarah Orr, who eventually purchased her from the owners in Washington, D.C. And in her biography, her autobiography, she gives us some information that time she remembers some things about her time as a slave, but that they weren't pleasant, and that because of certain things with her health as a child, she suffered throughout her life with poor health. So she was born in Washington, D.C. She was purchased by her aunt, Sarah Orr, who then moved her to Rhode Island. And in Rhode Island, Frances Jackson, that's her maiden name, she worked for some wealthy white families. And it is through those white families that she began to take some action to get an education. So she worked as a domestic, and she would encourage her mistress to help her learn to read. And at one point in the history, she even uses her own money to get someone to help tutor her to read. Now, we see earlier in her life that she was a very bright and capable woman. And there is also record that at the time, she also, while she worked in this woman's house as a maid, she also hired a tutor to teach her French. So once she got very comfortable with her ability to read and write, and she had done some learning on her own, she sat for admission to the Rhode Island Normal School. She was accepted and began her studies there. But soon after she began studying there, she realized that there was a limit to what they were teaching her and what she could learn at that point. So her desire for more learning and more education then led her to Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, which opened in about 1832 and was the only institution in the United States at that time that admitted Black people. So she enrolled in Oberlin, and at that time, the colleges in the United States had two different plans or curriculums for boys and or women and men. Women's curriculum was not considered that rigorous. The men were, they studied a curriculum that included Latin and Greek and other classical languages, higher mathematics, et cetera, and they called it the gentleman's course. So shortly after Jackson got there, she decided that she didn't want to do the women's course or the ladies' course. She endeavored to enroll in the gentleman's course, and she was accepted and excelled in that course. She excelled so much that before she graduated, she was asked by the faculty of Oberlin to teach some of the, I guess we would call it now, freshman and sophomore classes. However, they told her that they wanted her to teach, but if any white students who objected to having to take a class from a Black woman, that she would have to stop, because Oberlin accepted students from all over the United States, and many Southern wealthy planters had their children at the institution. But what we see in the records is that her teaching was so good that by the time she was ready to graduate, there was basically a waiting list to take a class from her. So her teaching career began at Oberlin before she ever graduated. While she was also at Oberlin, we know that the Civil War began, and there were refugees who came to Ohio, runaway slaves. She also opened a night school in Oberlin for older Black people who had run away or who were fugitives. So she took her classes, she taught classes at her alma mater, and she did a night school while still enrolled in Oberlin. She graduated in 1865, and by the time she graduated, she had received correspondence from this place called the Philadelphia Institute for Colored Youth. And so she then began or accepted the position at the Philadelphia Institute for Colored Youth, which is the building we now see in your slide in downtown Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So she began her work at the Institute in 1865 as the principal for the women's college, or not the women's college, but the women's department. And the Philadelphia Institute for Colored Youth was begun in the 1830s by Quakers who seemed to have had a passion for educating and doing all they could to assist African Americans in the United States. So she was brought in to the Institute as the principal for the female department, or the ladies department. And then they had another person, and we have, I think his name is Oliver Cato, who we also know a story about in terms of his activism and his radicalism in terms of exercising the right to vote for African Americans in Philadelphia. So Cato got involved in the political, I guess, as my daughter would say, the shenanigans of Philadelphia. And because after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the US government instituted certain rights that allowed African American men to vote. However, we know that was not necessarily a right that was given freely by many states and cities. So upon his effort to vote, Mr. Cato was shot and killed. And after he was killed, that meant that the Institute did not have a principal or for the men's division. So Mr. Bassett became the principal for the men's division. And then after a couple of years, he decided to leave. And instead of hiring another man, the Quaker Board of Managers for the Institute, because of Coppin's outstanding work there, decided to make her principal of the institution. And they no longer divided principalships between male and female. And so she became the first female principal of the Institute and the first African-American woman president of the Institute. So as her work started and went on at the Institute in 1871, as she saw how Reconstruction was going and she saw the number of newly freed slaves coming to Philadelphia and the poor economic situation they were in, she had in her mind that the Institute ought to be doing more to help students study and to pay for their studies as they went. So the solution for her in 1871 was to create an industrial department or a practical department where she could teach her students skills that they could then use in the general public to make money so that then they could continue their studies at the Institute. So in 1871, she had kind of a fight with the Quaker board. They didn't necessarily want it. And it also meant they had to add space to the Institute and they had to get equipment and so forth. And so she was very persistent in her pleadings and her arguments with the Board of Managers. And eventually they acquiesced to her suggestion. However, they put the responsibility of funding this new industrial department on her. So in 1871, she went about on her own going across the country and all over Philadelphia and the state of Pennsylvania, trying to raise funds to create the industrial department of this institute. Now, this is significant because at this time, this is at least 20, if not 30 years before we see Booker T. Washington's ideology of industrial education take hold. And it is different because it was for Coppin a means to an end and not a replacement of classical education and a liberal arts education for her students. She was able to, it took her 10 years to raise the money. So in 1881, the industrial department opened and it was a success. And everybody was proud. They had a great big exhibition and everyone was proud of her foresight. So as I said earlier, she was the only female principal, and she ended up being the longest serving principal of the Philadelphia Institute for Colored Youth. And she spent most of her teaching career there. While there, she initiated this industrial arts department for the institution. She also opened a home for young women to live and to board while they went to school. She also developed and instituted a missionary society that was attached to her own church, which was Bethel AME Church. She was a very loyal and faithful member of the AME Church. She also wrote for the Christian Recorder, which was the publication of the AME Church, while she was working at the Institute. She worked at the Institute until 1902. And in 1902, well, actually from about 1890 to 1900, things began to change with the Quaker Board. Booker T. Washington was gaining more prominence. His notion about what higher education should do for students and the emphasis on industrial education became more prominent. And because he was speaking all over the country, the Quaker Board of Managers started, thinking that his plan might be a good plan. She also got married to Bishop Levi Coppin, who was 10 years her junior, and I love that. And she got married, and that's where we get the name Coppin. And as it was a tradition in the 19th century, usually when a woman got married, she didn't work. That was not the case for Bishop Coppin. She continued to work. However, at the turn of the 20th century, he got appointed to be Bishop of South Africa, and Coppin was called on to represent the AME Church in several different meetings internationally. So by the time 1902 comes around, the Board of Managers have decided to adopt Booker T. Washington's model for education and decided to close the Philadelphia Institute in the city of Philadelphia, and they purchased a farm in Cheney, Pennsylvania, and closed the institute, and then it reopened under the name of Cheney Normal and an industrial and normal school in Cheney, Pennsylvania. Today, that school is Cheney State University, which is considered an HBCU. So when you hear Cheney State argue, or all on their website, they say they're the oldest HBCU in the country, it is because they connect their history to the Philadelphia Institute for Colored Youth. However, they don't really give the longest serving principal a lot of credit for the things that she did. So outside of her teaching, we know that she traveled to London as a representative of the home mission portion of the AME Church. And so she traveled to London to represent the United States and the AME Church in the foreign missions. And then we also know that in 1896, she, along with Mary Church Terrell, whom you may have heard of, helped to organize the National Association of Colored Women. And in fact, Frances Jackson Coppin was elected the vice president. Mary Church Terrell was elected the first president of the NACW, and Frances Coppin was its first vice president. So the next woman that I want to talk about is Hallie Quinn Brown. She was one of the most vocal and radical and politically active contemporary, albeit younger than Frances Coppin, of the women that I'm talking about. She was very overtly political in her teaching and in her personal life. She lived the longest of any of the women we're going to discuss. As you can see, she lived to be, if these dates are accurate, and I haven't seen anything to dispute it, to be 104 years old. She was a lifelong Republican, and she used to say it was probably a bias she inherited from her father. She was described as a bright and energetic and highly motivated woman who, despite the social and economic circumstances of the day in which they lived, she engaged in and accomplished extraordinary things. She was a prolific writer and a prolific speaker. We're going to hear more about that later. She published herself, she wrote and published at least 6 books during her lifetime. She gave hundreds of speeches. She also gave hundreds of performances before all kinds of people in the United States, with one of note being, she also traveled to London and she performed for the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, and actually had tea with her once. She performed for her several times and had tea personally with her one time. So Hallie Quinn Brown is different in that, so if we look at her experience, and we'll, give the details. She was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Her father and mother were born into slavery. However, her father was able to purchase himself and then his wife. So Hallie Brown was actually born as a free person. Because of the situation of the Civil War and some of the prejudices that they encountered in the United States, as a young child, they moved, when Hallie Brown was maybe school age, 5 or 6, her parents moved to Ontario, Canada, and actually wanted to provide a space for her to grow and to be educated without the turmoil of the United States. So they moved to Ontario, Canada, specifically to provide better educational experiences for their children. As she excelled in school and got older, they wanted her to go beyond the basic, what we now would call public and high school education, and wanted her to go on to college. So while they were away in Canada, they heard about Wilberforce University in Wilberforce, Ohio, and decided to come back to the United States to allow Hallie to attend Wilberforce University. So they moved back only after Wilberforce opened, and they came back so that she could attend. And the impression you get from the documents is that the family was very close, because when Hallie was accepted to Wilberforce, the entire family moved to Wilberforce, Ohio. At Wilberforce, she took what is called a scientific course, and she graduated in 1873. The She then, and once she graduated in 1873, and we know again from the date, this is also during Reconstruction, so there was a strong push for teachers to go south. She accepted a position to teach in a rural school in South Carolina, and she was successful there. It is also in South Carolina that she began to, she says, discover her gift for elocution. From South Carolina, she then was sent to a school in Mississippi. And of that particular time, she does say that it was very hard. And so these teachers did some extraordinary things. There is documentation that says that she actually, along with her students, had to basically rebuild the building they were given as a school. So she set out in a wagon and they made their own cement of the time. I can't recall the recipe, and actually filled in the gaps in the boards of the rundown building they had to work in. After her time in Mississippi, the work was so hard and so bad at that time, she got ill and she had to leave Mississippi. And then she was called back to South Carolina and became dean of Allen University at that time in 1885. After that, her reputation grew. And what you'll find out is that these women and a lot of these educators at this time knew of each other, talked about each other. So she came into the purview of Booker T. Washington, who invited her to work at Tuskegee for a short period of time. She didn't stay long, but she did go and work at Tuskegee. Now, some key things that I'd like to point out about Hallie Quinn Brown is that, to give you an idea of how political she was, is that in 1893 and in 1895, there was a World's Fair, and World's Fair at that time had various exhibitions, and they would often make a certain day for Black people to come, or they had a special exhibit for women. When the World's, and they call it an exposition, it was the World's Fair, but there was an exposition, and there was a call for an exposition of American women. The American women who were going to be in the exposition did not include any African American women. And Hallie Quinn Brown, along with some of her other contemporaries, began a letter writing campaign to lobby for and to tell them they should be ashamed of themselves for not having representatives of Black women in this exposition. And it is their letter writing campaign and their efforts that made the exposition give in and ultimately allowed speeches by various Black women in that exposition. And one of those women who was selected to speak was Frances Jackson Coppin. Now, her teaching kind of stopped at the end of the 19th century because Wilberforce University, at that time, she began to be a great fan of the discipline of elocution, which is what we would call public speaking and recitation or reciting poems and stories. And she began to become famous for her ability to recite poetry and to tell stories in public. And she would give concerts or do readings at various places for money. And as a result of her fame, Wilberforce asked her to join the Wilberforce Grand Concert Company that would tour and show off music, entertainment, and then, of course, elocution in order to raise money to build a library on Wilberforce University's campus. And of course, because of her love of her alma mater, she decided to do that. And so therefore she toured all over the United States and even to England on a fundraising campaign. She thought so much of elocution that she wrote a book, and she says, and I want to give you one of her quotes about elocution. She says, quote, "Elocution teaches the student that he is to cultivate these higher powers, that he is to quicken his sense of obligation to himself, to his fellow man, and to God. Elocution and its attendant branches educate simultaneously the three natures of man, combines and applies these separate studies as a whole, producing a well-rounded and fully developed being." And that's what she devoted her life to. In her later years, she was active in the Ohio Republican Party. She also became the 7th president of the National Association of Colored Women, and she continued to teach and was so influential that the library now today on the campus of Central State University is named in her honor. The next figure I want to talk about is Lucy Laney, and she is the youngest of the women that we're talking about. And I hope that you're seeing how the work that was started in the 19th century carried over into the 20th century. Some of these women had influence longer than others, and I'm going to talk about why I think that's important today. So when Lucy Laney died in 1933, it became national news. People like W.B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Charlotte Hawkins Brown, among numerous other people, attended her funeral and spoke there. Specifically, in her remarks, Charlotte Hawkins Brown said, quote, "Laney was an outstanding model of Negro womanhood in a world that was in short supply, and that Laney was a woman who was the inspiration of her childhood dreams, the fulfillment of my ideals for a useful life," end quote. Today, a portrait of Lucy Laney hangs in the Georgia State Capitol building, and she was the first African-American woman to have a portrait hung in the Georgia State Capitol. And she was one of the only 2 African-Americans to have an official portrait hanging in the Georgia State Capitol. The other person is Martin Luther King Jr. So Lucy Laney had a particular mission in educating young people and young African-American people. As we see from this quote, she says that her belief was, if you have the benefit of an education as a colored woman, that your burden is to uplift the less fortunate. So she founded the Haynes Industrial and Normal Institute in Augusta, Georgia, and devoted her life to the struggle to keep her school open by funding. She ran into difficulty because she wouldn't change the curriculum and insisted to continue to teach Greek and Latin and literature in addition to the industrial arts. So Lucy Laney, to give you more information about her, was born in Macon, Georgia, as you saw in 1854. She was born a free person in Georgia, and her story is very much like, her parents' story is very much like the story of Hallie Quinn Brown's parents. Her father purchased his freedom and then purchased his wife's freedom, and they remained in Macon. Later on, her father became a Presbyterian minister, and she would accompany her mother, who was a housekeeper for one of the wealthy families in Macon. And it is because she was so interested in learning, her parents taught her to read by the age of 4. And so her mother would often take her to work in her employer's house that had a library. And occasionally they would allow Lucy to read in the house. She was very smart and very brilliant in school and caught the eye of W.E.B. Du Bois and others, who were involved in creating and opening a school in Atlanta, a college, which we now know is Atlanta University. So she was recruited to be a part of the first class of Atlanta University. It is said that when she went to Atlanta University as a freshman, she had already read almost all of Shakespeare and already knew Latin and could read it and translate it. So many people call her basically a genius. So as a result of being in this first class, she felt that because of that accomplishment when she graduated in 1873, that it was her obligation to start and to, as we said from that first quote, to lift others and to provide education for her people. So as a result of that mindset, she opened and began a school in the kindergarten of a small church in 1883. And prior to that, between graduation and opening of the school, she worked in various cities around Georgia and Savannah. My hometown is one of them. And I remember as a child hearing her name, and I often wondered who she was. And then as I got more and more into academics and started my PhD, I began to read more about her. So the Haynes Institute opened in 1883 in Augusta, Georgia, and she picked that site specifically because of the population of African Americans at that time. The school was chartered in 1886, and among the things that she managed to accomplish was she created one of the first boarding preparatory college prep schools for African Americans in the country. Now, there are competing stories about how she did it. We know she started in the basement of a church in Augusta, Georgia. And one of the stories goes that she began to get more and more students, and the students would make noise. And so church members and neighbors complained that there were too many students and they made too much noise. So then she had to go out and find a location to continue her school. The need was there. So one of the other stories says that she found one of the least desirable pieces of land in Augusta, which some say was a garbage dump or had been at some point, purchased it very cheaply and put up a rough building like you see on the right side of this slide. And that's what she began with. And so a lot of her work in the beginning was to find funding for the school. And then she began boarding because she would have parents and poor students come and want to be educated, but they really had nowhere to pay. I mean, they had no money to pay, or they had nowhere to live. So she began to say, you can stay here and learn. And then as she began, the school gained a reputation and she began to get more funding. Then she was able to spruce up the building. And one of her most successful fundraising campaigns was she went north to Philadelphia to a convention of the Presbyterian Church because her father was a Presbyterian minister. And she made an appeal to the meeting to assist in funding her school. She did not get a good reception. And in fact, someone says she even had to ask for a train fare home because she went without any money. So she caught the attention of a woman by the name of Haynes, who was also the president of Wellesley's College. And the woman was so impressed with her, she decided to become a benefactor and help with the fundraising efforts. And as a result, Laney was able to get about $10,000 donated. And because that was the largest donation they got, they built the building you see on the right, which was the first modern building they were able to build at Haynes Institute. And Laney then decided to name her school after Mrs. Haynes, who had made such a big difference in her life. So Laney was one of those people who always looked for what else could she learn. So as a result of her desire to learn, to understand new techniques, new pedagogies, and to also meet the needs of the people she worked with or that she was servicing, we know that she began a kindergarten at the Institute as well. There was a need for mothers who had to work often in white homes for safekeeping of their children, and they should learn. So she is credited with starting one of the first kindergartens in the state of Georgia. By 1928, she had expanded the curriculum of the Haynes Institute to a junior college curriculum. She also started one of the first nursing schools at the Haynes Institute for African Americans. And she would use anyone who was willing to work with her. She got a nurse from Canada to come down and start this program. She had a building that was kind of dilapidated and full of pests that was given to the school in order to start the clinic for the nursing school. And eventually that program began to be a hospital and was associated with the hospital in Augusta, Georgia. Photos of her school were exhibited by W.E.B. Du Bois at the Paris Exposition in 1900. In other words, the work she was doing there became something that everyone was proud of, and they also began to say, look at the progress we've made by showing the efforts and talking about the efforts of Lucy Laney and the Haynes Institute. For Laney, the colored woman had the burden to uplift. And we know that at the end of her life in 1933, all of these famous people who came to her school and who were trained by her were at her funeral. One of the other people besides Charlotte Hawkins Brown was Mary McLeod Bethune, the founder of Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona Beach, Florida. In fact, Mary Bethune had her first teaching job at the Haynes Institute for Colored Youth. And some say that the famous story about Bethune buying land on a garbage dump and creating an institute was taken from the example of Lucy Laney. Mary McLeod Bethune said at Laney's funeral, quote, "Lucy Laney was the greatest Negro woman educator in the history of the race." And so finally, I just want to say, women like Hallie Quinn Brown, Frances Coppin, and Lucy Laney. For them, the classroom was never a place devoid of the influence and importance of their race, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It was key to their motivations, to the motivation for all that they did. The classroom for them was a place where they could exercise, or a student could exercise their racial identity and their responsibility to their race and the pride of their race. All of those things met, mingled, and battled in the classroom and under the umbrella of education. For all of these women, holistic education was key to the success not only of the individual, but of the race. These women are important for us to know and to continue to study because they were pioneers. They were pioneers in African American literacy. They were pioneers in terms of their politics, their radicalism, their feminism, their ideologies, and their methods are born out of experiences in multiple worlds, in multiple lands of experience, and the land of the slave, the freed woman, the white, the Black, the educated and uneducated. And I can say that we have only just begun to scratch the surface. And today I was only able to give you a brief overview of some women that I think are very important. And I would argue we continue to be influenced by, especially in institutions like North Carolina A&T and other HBCUs. I believe that many of their philosophies, ideologies, and even their pedagogies still exist in various spaces. They were too big to not have continued influence. Here is a photograph of the kindergarten at the Haynes Institute. I thought I'd share with you just so you see that it was true and documented. Now, I want to leave you with a few books. If you really want to know more about these women, here are some sources for further reading. And I think they will give you a curiosity and a desire to know more and more about these women. Thank you. I'd be glad to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really, really incredible. And I did learn a lot. So thank you so much. We do have one question in the Q&A, and then I have a couple of questions as well. But if anybody else has any questions, either on the Facebook live stream, feel free to drop that as a comment. And if you have a question in the Zoom, drop it in the Q&A or in the chat. That is perfectly fine. So our question here gives you your props. You channeled these women in their efforts well. What would they or you say about educational opportunity and attainment in the present day?
Well, to be honest with you, I think they would be a little disappointed that it's not what it was then. And especially since we have access to so many more things, or so many things that can take our attainment even further. As a matter of fact, as I looked at some of the curriculum in some of my research, I have examples of their final examinations in some of the schools, and I don't even know if I could have passed. And this was not even, they were not even teaching college. This was actually college prep, high school. And all of the examinations were in essay form. And all of them involved, especially for the women, involved translating Latin or Greek or something. I probably would not have been able to graduate. So I think we are a long, long way from them. I mean, there are all kinds of debates, and we've seen it throughout the 20th century about the value of learning something like Latin and Greek. And you see it retained in certain exclusive private prep schools in the United States. But I think we have slipped a lot. And we don't demand, in my opinion, the level of intellect, the rigor. It's just not there anymore. And I think many of us would not have been successful in their schools. I don't think we could.
I think about that every day when I look at the Palmer curriculum in the early years, and I'm just like, I don't know. Yeah, I think about this a lot out in our work too at the site, and also your going through your presentation, looking at Frances Coppin and the way that all of these women really, in the education that they were giving students, it was this well-rounded thing, this balance of the industrial arts and the classical and your college, what is now labeled college preparatory, right?
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to then track throughout history. You mentioned with Frances Coppin, that Booker T. Washington influence coming in, and this thing that she had to fight to even include in the curriculum in the first place, then kind of consumes everything else and becomes the overarching ideology. And there's this other question about the biggest impediment to a fuller education today. And I don't know that there is a single answer to that, but I look at these lines throughout history where we see this tendency for people to think, this is the best way, this is the one thing. And even in how folks talk about the Booker T. Washington versus the W.E.B. Du Bois philosophies and educations. So I'm curious to hear what you think about that kind of dichotomy and this kind of trend over time to simplify or reduce education to one element or one thing, as opposed to what we see historically, these women including this kind of balance.
Yes. Well, my argument, and one of the reasons that I became so involved with studying and writing about these women was because, one of the things in my bio, it mentions that I went to a segregated elementary school in Alabama. And it was my principal, her name was Maud L. Watley. And there was just this presence and this dignity, and that required the student and the teacher to carry themselves, to talk to them in a certain way. And I remember my father, I used to, everybody was afraid of my father, but the principal of my elementary school was the one who he was afraid of, he respected so much. And so I always wondered, where did she get this idea about how to be as an educator? So I started reading about these women. And one of the things about Coppin is that, and I'm getting to, I hope, an answer to your question, is that Booker T. Washington visited the Institute for Colored Youth, and there is an evidence of a letter he wrote to the Board of Managers, and he basically said, there's too much, reading of French and Latin and not enough pushing of a broom. And so it is really Booker T who helps push them to closing the ICY down and moving it to a farm in Cheney. And it was because of the notoriety and the respect he had gotten and the so-called success of his students at Tuskegee. But more for me, I think a lot of what was happening to these women is that they were women and that they were Black women. And you have to understand that in the 19th century, particularly the late 19th century up until the first part of the 20th century, you have this cult of true womanhood. You have a prevailing Western societal notion that the way a woman should contribute to a people is by having a good home. And so therefore, it was unusual for women to do work while being married. And you'll see that Hallie Quinn Brown never got married. Lucy Laney never got married. The only one is Coppin. And of course, her marriage is unconventional. So I think that's a lot of it. And it's also, I think race is a part of it. What do you want from a group of people who were your primary workers? Do you really want them to have an education that will make them aspire to be a lawyer on an equal footing for you? Or do you want them to have the skills you need to do work? Which one do you want? Booker T got lots of support from white America. And it got to the point where these other schools who wouldn't stop teaching Latin and Greek by these women, they found it hard to get money to continue the work. So it's racism and sexism. So did I answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me think of this time period at Palmer where Dr. Brown is starting this transition from, Palmer started as an industrial and vocational school, but she's always teaching the social curriculum and teaching some of the more traditional and classical things kind of under the table, right? Mm-hmm. It reminds me of this period in the 1920s and 1930s where she's really starting to push that envelope and really starting to push that college preparatory education at Palmer, and struggles a lot financially. Yes. And has to wrestle with the reality. Dr. Brown has to wrestle with the options that are available to her. One of them is to turn over control to the American Missionary Association and step down and allow her school to kind of be taken away, but have secure funding, which is an option that she declines. And what really ends up saving Palmer and propelling Palmer is this network of Black women. You mentioned that they all talk to each other, they're all friends, they're all inspired by each other. Mary McLeod Bethune helps fund Palmer through the 1930s so that they can get their feet under them. And that's what gives Palmer the opportunity. That's what gives Dr. Brown the opportunity to turn Palmer into this great social finishing and elite college preparatory school that it becomes. And so these connections to each other and looking out for one another is so vital to their work. Having Lucy Laney as an example set Mary McLeod Bethune up, set Dr. Brown up, having Hallie Quinn Brown, having Frances Coppin. So how did they know about each other? The NACW shows up often. Is that really how they are staying in communication with each other and learning about each other?
Well, I think that, and I'm glad you see that, because that's what I think there's a continuum that, Coppin kind of plows the ground in a lot of ways. And she was able to do the work she did so long because she wasn't a school founder. She had the Quakers, funding the school, but she still had to fight for the curriculum that she wanted. But I think one of the reasons that they knew each other and socialized, part of it was the NACW. But part of it was, it was a small network of so-called educated people. For example, Frances Coppin and Mary Church Terrell and other women, Frances Hopper, they knew of each other partly because of Oberlin. They knew each other partly because of the AME Church. And so they would correspond. The other thing that intersects a lot of these women in their work is Frederick Douglass. Well, both Frances Coppin and Hallie Quinn Brown knew Frederick Douglass, and he knew of them. As a matter of fact, when Hallie Quinn Brown goes to England to raise money, she takes with her a letter of introduction from Frederick Douglass. And so then you also saw that Du Bois knew and was a friend of Laney. So it was kind of a small group. And whereas if you knew one person like Douglass or Du Bois or Booker T. Washington on some level, then that puts you in contact with the others. And then the NACW comes about because one of the things Black women in the AME church did was they started with these little 25-cent benevolent, clubs in their cities. And so there were lots of women's groups. For example, Hallie Quinn Brown also created a text because sometimes the women would get together just to read and recite poetry and other kinds of things together. And she makes a book for them with readings for them to use. And so word of mouth got around quite a bit because of who knew who and introductions. Some of these people, for example, Coppin also interacted with white abolitionists at the time. So there is one letter, I could have had 50 slides of all kinds of interesting things, but that's just ridiculous. And you have not only Black people talking about them, but you also have whites who sympathize and who support them, or who are working in the same cause, who know them and put them in touch with each other. And then because these women are all over the country doing some of the same things, Mary Church Terrell says, well, why don't we find some way to connect everybody through the NACW? And so that's how the NACW comes, because you've got all these women in these clubs who kind of know each other, kind of doing the same thing. So what about we come together and have an annual meeting? And so that's how that starts. And then the other thing, particularly with Coppin, is that part of her fame was her teacher training. And part of what she actually did was she began to send hundreds of teachers to the South. And so where did you go to school? The ICY, and then you also didn't have a lot of schools run, for African Americans at that time too. So it was small. Your choices were kind of limited, but then again, they weren't. And so it was some of the same people doing the same work, and that's how they kind of networked and worked together.
That's wonderful. One of my neighbors has decided that this is the perfect time to start leaf blowing. So if there's background noise, we do have a question on Facebook. So are there women's organizations around now that you see embodying the same spirit of the Black women's movement, or organizations in general that you see kind of carrying on similar work?
Well, the NACW, the National Association of Colored Women, it still exists. You can visit their webpage, and they are still trying to carry on. It is the NACW, when it was formed in 1886, that gives us the motto, lifting as we climb. So that's the motto of that particular organization, and it still exists. And they're still, running programs to do certain things, but I can't say there's another organization that is as busy as it was at that time. There are pockets, but in terms of a coalition around a national cause or a push for something, I can't say that there is one. There are fragmented pockets here and there.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how we think of our world as much more connected nowadays because we have the internet, because we have these tools and this amount of globalization. But in some interesting ways, it's also become so segmented and so specialized that we don't have the same kind of access that these women did, or that folks did.
Or unity.
Unity, yes.
They were unified in their purpose.
Yeah.
Where, no matter what you're doing, wherever you are, this is what we're pushing for everybody. And one of the other things they did is they had a publication called the Women's Era. And they would, in that publication, they would have each state report. So it was very well organized, and they kept in touch. even at a time when it was harder than it is today to keep in touch. And that's why it's fascinating to me, because my question has always been, what happened? Why are we like this now? What happened?
Right, right. And I also,
Or how can we get back to it?
right. And so all of this also makes me think about, which actually, so one of the books that you recommended, we sell in our gift shop, the Shelter in a Time of Storm. So please come by. That is a great book you can get at the site. But it also makes me think about a recent book, Fugitive Pedagogy.
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
by Jarvis Givens, which covers Carter G. Woodson, but also this idea of African-American education, and Black educators have always had this kind of fugitive pedagogy, right? This what they're teaching and how they're teaching it. Yeah, maybe you can speak more to it, but the architecture of Black education was not allowed and has always been kind of a pushing of the envelope, right? And then that book, Shelter in a Time of Storm, all about how HBCUs fill this role of creating and educating activists and pioneers who carry forward African-American liberation and equality and equity and all of these things. You know, one of the questions that we get all the time from visitors when we talk about Palmer is what gets lost with integration? Is this one of those things? And from your life experience and your study, is this one of those things that gets harder to have this clarity and unity of purpose once you have an integrated classroom, or the expectation of having an integrated system? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I understand it, and I think it's a good question. And I think part of what gets lost is the freedom to kind of be yourself, and to talk about the issues you want to talk about without fear of recrimination, without fear of being name called or condemnation. Where you have someone older who has experience to say, I understand your experience, but let me help you negotiate. This is how you might want to respond in this particular place. So these schools and spaces had to be safe spaces, and I have some colleagues who talk about safe spaces, because integration brings about a lack of comfort, I think, and an inability to be your authentic self. And I'm talking from personal experience. It brings then a continuous gaze by whites on you that can be used to judge, can be used to evaluate you unfairly, and it's not always to help you. So it changes to not. So when integration comes, you don't get the nurturing part of it. You begin to it's only information and performance. So you've got to know this information. You got to show me that you know it. Whereas in segregated spaces, you might get pulled aside. For example, you've got all kinds of, one of the reasons Coppin wants, she opens this boarding school in the School for Women, the boarding school in Philadelphia, is because she notices that a lot of these girls are being accosted at home, or they're having to stay in boarding houses with men who don't have the best intentions. And so because their learning is important to her, she wants them to feel safe. It's the same reasoning. In other words, I hate to say mother, but it's like, mama, what do you need in order to achieve whatever you want to achieve? You need a safe space. So we're going to open a house just for girls, because the ICY was not a boarding school. So, or you need money to pay for your uniform and your books and tuition. Oh, well, how about we teach you a trade so that you can do it very well and make money so that you can pay your tuition. Same thing with Lucy Laney. One of the accounts that was written in 1927 about her is one of the things they said: she couldn't turn away a poor, destitute child when they wanted to come, or a parent and they didn't have clothes. And I remember that about my elementary school principals. We would get put in jail for doing that today, but she kept sets of clean clothes in her office. Ms. Watley did. She kept soap and a towel. She would let kids take baths at school and give them fresh, clean clothes, because all of that, for the women, in my mind, impacts whether or not you receive the information or the knowledge that I'm trying to give you, so that you can use it. So it wasn't just going to school to get a degree, it was going to school to change your life. And I think that segregation took that away from us. I mean, desegregation to some extent. We had to be different in a lot of ways. So yeah, did that address everything?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting to see, can you speak to any of the ways that kind of educators have you seen that educators recently are trying to fill that gap in a way? Or do you think we are just fully like, it is performance, it is knowledge acquisition, and then get out? Because I think we've seen, especially since the pandemic and everything that's happened, that folks do want a more complete experience for their students. And so what are the ways that you have seen within the educational system that we have that folks are able to, or are they able to, bring some of that more nurturing element back into the classroom?
Well, I definitely think there are teachers who are trying their best to bring some of that back. And that's one of the reasons I like to, talk to young teachers, because many of them have very innovative ways of bringing those ideas and those elements into the classroom. And there are some, let's say last week we started a symposium on writing, rhetoric, and composition at the HBCU at A&T several years ago. And each year is hosted by another HBCU. And so this past week, it was in Jackson, Mississippi, at Jackson State. And as we know, the political climate in certain states is worse or more, I don't even know how to describe it. But one of the things that we learned in that symposium was that the faculty at Jackson State, in response to this notion about not teaching CRT in the classroom, not talking about certain things of the Black experience, their faculty actually took a public stand and just basically said, we're going to defy you, we're going to disobey. I think it was the 3 Ds. We're going to deny, denounce, and disobey, and maybe something else. And so we're going to continue to do those things that we believe our students need. If they want to talk about it, we're going to talk about it. And we're not going to lie to them. And I think in the public school, I've seen some innovations by certain teachers. Everybody's seen on social media certain clips where the students come in and they give a high five to the teacher, or the student will ask for a hug, or you choose what you want. I think those are ways of communicating, some small ways that teachers are trying to say, I care about you, and what I have to offer in terms, your education is about you and not necessarily just about the information. I saw a music teacher not too long ago who was using gospel music in his chorus classroom in a public school. And the kids sounded better than a church choir. So I think there are people who are doing it, but much more on an individual basis. The statement at Jackson State was the first one I've heard of where the faculty as a whole decided to speak back to some of these things. But I think individuals, especially in the public school and in secondary education, they're doing it on an individual basis. And a lot of them are doing it in a climate of peril. But of course, my argument is if these women could do it in Reconstruction and in Jim Crow, the Jim Crow era, then yeah, we can do it too. But it has to be something, I believe, that comes in from your internal moral compass. But I do think people are trying. I don't think that it's a system-wide thing, though.
Yeah, and listen, like you said, if these women can do it and establish these networks and create this pattern, why can't we be a part of that history as well? So there are some comments in the Q&A that you should take a look at that are giving you your props and saying thank you. But I thank you so much, Dr. Maor, for coming. Thank you everybody for attending. This has been a really fantastic evening. Thank you so much for your work. We will stay engaged and stay in touch. So thank you everybody so much and have a fantastic night.
My pleasure. Thank you.